a las personas que no hablan inglés. Ya les avisamos que hay aparatos de traducción simultánea afuera para un tema de facilitar la transmisión por distintos canales, que uno salga en inglés y el otro salga en español. Toda la conversación acá adelante va a ser en inglés, así que mil disculpas a toda la chilenidad de habla hispana que está aquí. I would like to begin by thanking the Institute for Sustainable Development, el IDS, a fairly new academic unit at Universidad Católica, for hosting these dialogues that invite us to imagine sustainable futures. I would also like to thank the audience for being here on a springy Friday afternoon, basically the current and previous students of the sustainability elective. I'd also like to thank the Center for Educational Justice, CJE, for accepting the invitation to co-host this event, and particularly Claudia Matus, the current director, for accepting to be the discussant for this afternoon. And I also want to thank Rodolfo Sapiens, who is a professor at Universidad de Chile and Universidad de Magallanes. Dr. Sapiens is a community psychologist and has researched on climate anxiety. Thank you for accepting to perform as a discussant this afternoon. And finally, I need to thank the National Research and Development Agency, ANID, and their program Fondos de Iniciación for funding my own research, How Radical Can Hope Be?, which allows us to have Professor Marek Oziewicz from the University of Minnesota here today with us. Professor Oziewicz is founder of the Climate Lit Org. He is the guest editor of the special issue on climate literature in the scholarly journal The Lion and the Unicorn, editor of the book Fantasy and Myth in the Anthropocene, Imagining Futures and Dreaming Hope in Literature and Media, and also the article Why Children's Stories Are Powerful Tool to Fight Climate Change, to name just a few of his very recent works. Marek, thank you for coming all the way down from Central North USA and to share your research and reflections with us. The floor is yours.
Does it work? Okay, wow. Thank you, everyone. I wanted to thank Andrea and Claudia and everyone at Católica for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. It's my first time in the Southern Hemisphere. My name is Marek. I'm originally from Poland. I'm Polish-American. I'm a professor of children's and young adult literature at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And I have spent my pretty much entire professional life studying how narratives for a young audience shape the way we think and act in our world. And I want to talk about climate literacy, and I want to talk about writing our own futures with imagination. I'm going to use my notes here to make sure that I'm on track. And I wanted to start by saying that I'm very glad that the title of this lecture series connects to stories. We need sustained and sustainable dialogues about where we are as a global civilization and as local communities. We also need to figure out what sustainability means, when it matters, how we achieve it in practice, not in PR. And we also need to learn to use imagination prefiguratively to help us imagine where is it that we want to get with imagination. So, and this of course connects to the use of imagination as a tool to achieve real life outcomes. And I want to talk about this aspect today. And I will suggest specifically that narrative fiction, which is a fancy term for stories, that narrative fiction is one of the best tools we have to imagine, work toward, and achieve sustainable futures. So that's what my talk is going to be about. And because I'm a scholar of children's and young adult literature, I will mostly talk about Well, I probably won't have time to touch upon in many titles, but I will talk about literature for young audiences. Okay, because I'm also an educator, I work with teachers and teacher candidates. I will specifically focus on the role of education as a system, as a cultural system. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and other urgencies of the Anthropocene, they present us with an existential challenge. And of course, you all know this. And when you think about an existential challenge, and you've heard this climate crisis, climate emergency, there are many terms for the condition in which we find ourselves today. So by existential, I mean a couple of things. The first meaning of existential is that it's such a freaking complicated and complex and interlocked process happening on so many levels at the same time that the vast majority of people on this planet today don't even realize what's happening. We don't know what's happening. This article says that the scale of the threats is so great that it is difficult to grasp for even experts. Even disciplinary experts are struggling to grasp what's going on. So that's one meaning of existential. The other meaning of existential is that all of these processes, climate change seems to refer to one thing, but in fact, it's a group, it's a cluster of things. And these things are happening at the same time, they bump against each other, and they accelerate. And that's why we have this term, the great acceleration. These things are happening not just fast, they're happening faster. All of the hurricanes, heat waves, droughts, mega fires, everything we've seen so far were unleashed by 1.1 Celsius temperature rise above pre-industrial norm. And how many people realize that almost half of this warming was added since 1990? So in the past 30 years, we have heated the planet so much as we had heated the planet from the beginning of humanity until 1990. So the scale and the pace of these things is so unbelievable that IPCC, all of the reports of IPCC, this comes from 2018, but they urge humanity, politicians, please change the system now because we are running out of time. And the recent report, so they talk about rapid, far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban infrastructure, industrial systems, unprecedented in scale. We have to change everything, not just one or two or five things, everything. And the last report from 2021 says that we will probably reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2040, which is very well in your lifetimes, in my lifetime. And some recent reports say that it can be as early as 2031, 32 or so. So what we're seeing, the trajectory of what we're doing to the planet is that we are actively transforming Earth into Mars. And this will happen probably in our lifetimes. Even a 3-degree warming is unbelievably disastrous. So we are approaching these planetary thresholds, and we have to do something. So the urgency here is that we can still, at this point, avoid these worst scenarios. We can avoid them. And so the crisis is an opportunity for change. And specifically, what needs to happen, or one of the things that need to happen, is that we should probably reimagine education. Reimagine education so that it helps us become climate literate. And building universal climate literacy as a goal for education for now and going forward. And you may ask, what is climate literacy? What makes a person climate literate? Like we have computer literacy, we have linguistic literacy, we have all of those specialized types of skills, right? So climate literacy, what is climate literacy? The definition that I've been using is this, that is the ability to grasp the challenges posed to humanity and the planet by the climate emergency, and the ability to tell a story about it. You need to be able to tell a story to yourself and to others. And so this is the way of telling these stories that engage anticipatory imagination, that mobilize action. Climate literacy means that you understand numbers and facts, which is a term, climate science literacy. We've had this term for about 10 years now. But it's more, climate literacy centers on developing values, attitudes, and behavioral change that need to be in place for us to transition into an ecological, sustainable civilization. So preparing a longer version of this talk, I prepared 4 Google Forms for you. We have no time for these forms, but I will occasionally refer to these forms as we move on. So in relation to climate literacy, I want to share with you 2 inspirations. The first inspiration is Sir Ken Robinson, and there is a talk, his last talk, recorded from his London home in August 2020, just before his death. Some of you may be familiar with Robinson's work on imagination and creativity in education. He was a brilliant, brilliant public speaker. You can find his TED Talks on YouTube. And in this last talk, Creating the New Normal, that's the title, Robinson identified climate change and our disconnect from nature as 2 most serious problems for today's world. And he said that our job, our challenge, is to reimagine education so that it makes a settlement with the earth, plants, animals, and all life. So we need a different education. And the way I understand this last talk by Robinson is that he says we need education based on climate literacy. The second inspiration I want to share with you is another TED Talk. Well, the first one was not. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she's an American-Nigerian author. And the title of the talk was The Danger of a Single Story. And teachers in America use this talk a lot to make an argument to our students that we need diverse literatures in our classroom. Because unless you have read many different stories or are exposed to different stories, you will be locked in a very narrow single story that blocks your understanding of nuances. You just have a very narrow scope of understanding. So this talk is usually shown as an example why we need multiculturalism. But I think that the key point she makes also applies to our understanding of climate literacy, of where we are now as human beings on this planet. So specifically, I want to suggest that our global petro-civilization is locked in a single story. What is the single story of our global civilization? Well, it's a story of benevolent billionaire overlords, of wonderful future colonies on Mars for Elon Musk and his ilk. It's the future of singularity in which rich old men can upload their consciousness into cloud and live forever, and they don't really bother about the rest of us. So this single story future paradoxically has very strong resonance with another big story that some of you at least probably have heard a version of. And this other version of the story has been called by Jamie Wheel in his recent book, Rapture Ideologies. This is a very weird American term, rapture ideologies. And ISIS fighters, Christian Zionists, doomsday preppers, there are many groups around the world that talk about the end of the world coming. We have to get ready. And there are many versions of this story, but each version has 4 exactly the same elements. Narrative structure is like this. This world is unsavable, it's going down, it will collapse very soon, but me and my group, we will survive So let's hasten the ending of this bad world so that we can reemerge in the world for us, and everyone else will die. There are so many versions of this story today. And when you think about what's happening globally with inaction on climate change, so let's assume that our civilization is locked in this single story. But what are the alternative stories? British eco-philosopher Rupert Read talks about 3 options. Realistically, we have 3 options going forward. And these 3 options you can also find in scientific literature, and you can find them in narratives by non-mainstream environmental groups like Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, the Sunrise Movement, and mostly youth movements, people like you, your age. So what are these 3 options that we have? One option is that we can manage to rapidly transform and become an ecological civilization, okay? Second option is that our current petro-ecocidal civilization will collapse, but in the time of collapse, it will seed a successor civilization. So something else will emerge alongside. The third option is that our current civilization will fall utterly and terminally. Everything will collapse, game over. These are the 3 options for now. And again, when you think about our political institutions, our financial institutions, our banking systems, our economy, none of those leaders are considering any of these 3 options. They are locked in a fairy tale, magical thinking of neoliberal growth forever, expansion into space, and everyone having more and more money. That's a fairy tale. It's not happening. So where I find hope is that young people are getting angry. People like you, people like Greta Thunberg. And increasingly young people talk about this. If solutions within the system are so impossible to find, hey, maybe we need to change the system. And we know that system change has happened in the past. So we are not doomed to continue in this unsustainable trajectory on which we're currently find ourselves. So of course, as we emerge from COVID, what better time for change, for radical change? In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire, he proposed this term conscientization, which is a very weird English translation, but the term refers to making an awareness, becoming aware of the deep complexity of the issue, that we are able to see beyond palliative solutions, and we're able to actually address the problem rather than pretend to address the problem. So my sense, my belief is that we have entered a conscientization of climate change today, that it's unstoppable. More and more people, including young people like you, know about climate change and know that we need to do something together. So, okay, how do you change the system? Okay, that's a great question. How do you change a system? We live in an entrenched, extremely destructive system. And all of the elements of the system are interconnected and reinforce one another. How do you change a system? So I propose, and it's not just me saying this, a lot of people have already said this, that everything starts with a vision of alternatives to the way things are. We need to have an alternative. Visions need stories in which you can communicate this vision. You can express it in words. And so the trajectory, the sort of grammar that I think is a valid description, is that everything starts with stories. Stories become visions. Visions become work, and work becomes reality. So you have these 4 steps: stories, visions, work, reality. Okay? And I wanted to show you at this point these 2 clips, but I will ask Piero to send you links to these 2 clips. You can watch them at home. One is, I think, 3 minutes, another is 4 minutes. And one of the forms I designed for this presentation was watch these films and tell me what are the emotions you feel when watching these clips. We have, okay, sorry, no, okay, no. We're moving on. But the whole point that I think these two clips, and there's many other examples in stories for young people, and not only young people. What these examples show is that storytelling and story as a tool is perhaps the best avenue we have to address, to start to grapple with the problems of climate change. So my suggestion is that we need to make concern with climate change a private thing and a private concern, and to make something private, that's something that you deeply feel, it must be an issue for storytellers. So we need discussions about climate change. We need these discussions to be developing through stories that are told in families, in schools, in churches, in communities, everywhere. Okay, so we need compelling stories. And there is a lot of evidence. I'm going to quickly jump through a number of examples that, this notion that everything starts with stories, it sounds kind of simple, but there's a massive body of research supporting these notions. And this is a quote from Brian Boyd's On the Origin of Stories, that narrative reflects our mode of understanding events. So that the notion here is that we are designed by evolution. Our minds are designed to think through stories. When you have a story, you remember. When you have facts, they just go. So if you embed knowledge in stories, it stays with you and it generates new understandings. That's the sort of really very basic grammar of how human beings function. I want to stop now and give you 1 minute. Let's do form 4. So I want to ask you about, what do you think is the dominant story of our civilization? If there is something like global civilization on this planet, what are the elements of the story? Can we share the link to, you should be able to see QR code. Okay, this should take you a minute, maybe even less. Let's do it now. So there are 4 questions here. Does it work? Can you open it? Okay, thanks. Is anyone done? Anyone has completed the form? Okay, let's take another 30 seconds, okay?
It seems like this is the complete form, and the previous one was the form for you to make questions.
Ooh, okay, scan this. So the form that should open is the form about the dominant story of our civilization. It has 4 questions. Is that the right form? Can you see it now? Okay, great, let's do it. Piero, can we go back to the Prezi, please? So while you're working on the form, I'm going to scroll forward. No. Anyone is done? Complete? It's like 15 seconds. Okay, great, thank you. So I just scrolled through a number of slides for which we have no time, where I talk about specific examples that support some of the claims I make in this talk. But I want to bring it back to education, and I want to leave you with a couple of final thoughts. So how does the challenge of climate change translate into this field called education? I believe that the situation in which we find ourselves is largely due to the fact that we are a climate illiterate civilization. Nobody ever told us how to be a good earthling, how to live on this planet the right way. Nobody taught us this. And we kind of stumbled into climate change. We stumbled into biodiversity loss. We stumbled into pollution. We never planned it. So if you start with this insight that the problem is climate illiteracy, then the solution is education. Because if we were climate literate, technology would not be a problem. If we were climate literate, politics would not be a problem. The problem is that we are a climate illiterate civilization. But the silver lining with this is that illiteracy can be overcome. We can learn to do things differently. And this is what education is all about. We haven't done climate literacy education yet, but we're beginning to. And there is a ton of attempts and efforts happening all over the world. The sustainability program that you have here is one of them. So the point is that we don't teach about climate change. We don't teach about climate literacy, but we should. So I want to show you an example. This is a website, a project in which Andrea is also part of the team. We created a website hub called climatelit.org. And the notion here is that we want to provide tools for teachers everywhere, across all subject areas and across all grade levels, so that teachers can smuggle components of climate literacy in whatever classes they teach, at kindergarten level, elementary school level, high school level, college level, everywhere. We need these discussions to be happening at all times, everywhere. And the notion here is that education is the way to lead us out of the current predicament, because we have no planet B, and because everyone deserves a future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marek. You were sharp on time. Excellent. And now Claudia is going to do her remarks, and then Rodolfo is going to make his remarks, and then you can reply to them. And meanwhile, to the audience, please remember that you have that Menti that was projected before. So you can start channeling your own questions for later, okay?
Thanks so much, Marek, for your presentation and your spirit, and your effort to put narratives or the ways we tell stories as a way to overcome the crisis we're living in. And I'm going to talk from the research I do and my interest in how to help to build an argument on why we should use, or we should, from the field of education, to promote some ways of transforming or changing. And I think we are in some ways very into the same narrative, but to me, when you mentioned, for instance, that, and this is probably a question for you, or maybe we can talk later about it, but when we address the question on how do we change or how do we produce change, and you provide the answer that stories can be a source for transforming, immediately comes to me the idea that stories are not neutral. I mean, there are different kinds of stories, and we should ask what kind of stories are willing to be heard. So that's something that I would like to listen from you to talk about a little bit more. So when I come back to the question, how do we produce change or transformation? One of the things I've been very interested in is what happens in schools and the ways we have learned about, for instance, the relationship between nature and culture. Which has been, I mean, if you look at your own experiences in schools, you're going to come back to this idea that humans are something different from nature. And we as humans are kind of observers of that what happens outside. And actually, we wrote an article recently published in which we make the argument that whenever we mention trees, for instance, we immediately think that is something completely different, and that would be nature. But when we name humans, that would mean culture. So that is something that is very problematic, because that idea, or the non-relation between nature and culture, it's a way in which we frame everything we do in our daily lives, and also institutions, of course. So one of the things that when we come back to education and the ways in which we can promote some ways of changing, to me will be to pay attention to the ways we have known about that kind of relationship, and that actually is a non-relation. To me, for instance, one of the other things, from this way of framing the problem, to me, in looking at or listening to what you were just telling us, for instance, that the idea of narrative brings the notion of imagination, right? And to me, it would be interesting also for you to tell us a little bit more about what's the idea of human behind that idea of imagination. I mean, who's that human that is able to imagine? Is that human that we have learned from our experiences in school, that is the human that is superior to those other species who live out there? And if it is so, in what ways we have to change the idea of human we have, in order to enter to this idea you are presenting as a possibility for change. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes, so that's why I'm trying to create an argument. So I think that what I'm trying to say here is that the ways we have learned about what happens out there, which is something that is a very productive, entanglement of things happening. And the ways that we now bring that idea, that how do we approach or how do we come back to that idea of constantly evolving ways of relating between different species, how do we, at the moment of crisis we're right now, how can we come back to that idea and relate as humans who have been constructed as very far away from that, incredible emergent way of encountering, and producing reality as what happens in nature. So in here, I'm addressing the idea of, I don't know if you've heard of Anna Tsing, which is a wonderful, wonderful scholar. And she in this project that I'm actually very fond of, she explains a lot of ideas about how we have come to be so separated from what happens in nature. And for instance, she talks about the idea of progress. For instance, how we have been taught about the modern idea of progress, and what are the problems that are embedded in this widely accepted assumption about what it means to be human. Okay, so for instance, probably if I tell today that is there any one of you who can think about yourselves as not thinking that there is always something better ahead? That idea of progress, that we are always, constructing our idea of humans as different from other species in the living world, because we look forward. We are able to look forward. So whenever we think about that idea that we as humans have that capacity, immediately other species, get in a very different dimension, in which as they live the day by day, it will make us think that they depend on us. So that idea, for instance, that present Anna thinks to me is a very important idea that we have to question the idea of progress and humans as being, those who we are differentiated from other species because we are able to look ahead, to anticipate, to have that kind of agency. So I think that, and this is another idea that Anna Sings presents, which is like we need a different way of noticing today, different ways of being an observer, and a different way to look at how the things happen. So probably that would be an idea that connects to what you were saying, Marek, in the idea that probably a story, we need, of course, concrete stories to give life to concepts. But I think that the ways we notice would be a way to produce also a story that is able to be told and be heard in a way that we can, hopefully to find some ways out of this crisis. So I don't know how 2 more minutes. Well, I think I agree with the idea. I mean, I think that to build reality through stories is something that is very old. Indigenous knowledges and communities, they have always been constructed through stories. So I think that it's also important to maybe to talk about what's the difference between the stories that you are promoting right now from those who we already know about, indigenous communities and knowledges who have been doing this for centuries. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for the invitation, Andrea, and thank you very much for your presentation, Marek. It was an inspiration, really. And I have a short presentation because I was asked to react to yours, but I realized that what I'm doing now is totally related to what Marek is just presented. And I'm a psychologist, but I'm working in different issues related to climate change, environmental problems. And one of those issues that I think is probably one of the most important mental health issues we have now, and is going to be like that for the, I don't know, next 10, 20 years, is eco-anxiety. And I think when Marek talked about that we need to tell a different story, I cannot be more agree with that, because I think that's exactly what we are missing, in climate change communication, So, voy a usar mi cronómetro, some Spanglish. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I want to ask you from 1 to 10. So 1 is not at all, and 10 is very concerned. How worried are you about climate change? 1 es no me importa el cambio climático, y 10 es estoy totalmente preocupado, no puedo dormir, estoy muy mal con esto. So how worried are you from 1 to 10 about climate change? Okay, just the first reaction. So I'm going to ask, 1, who say 1? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, fair enough. We could say that's like a 7, probably, the average. I always ask this before any presentation, and the younger the audience, the higher the score. Okay. Where is the computer? Okay, so as Marek said, the problem with climate change is basically uncertainty, unpredictability, and uncontrollability. We don't know how to deal with those things from a psychological standpoint. Okay, so we have a really, really complicated problem. And eco-anxiety, there's a definition from the APA, a chronic fear of environmental doom. And although it seems that most forms of eco-anxiety are not like clinical, there are some cases, and there are a growing field of study that is reporting more and more problems associated with this in young people and children. Okay, and we also have a family of emotional responses to climate change: eco-anger, eco-anxiety, eco-depression. And we have some studies, especially in the US, in Europe, about this. We really need more research about these things in Chile, Latin America. But we do know that there's some interaction between emotions like anger and collective pro-environmental behaviors. And it's the opposite with anxiety. And interestingly enough, with depression, it's more likely that people, could get involved in some collective action. The point is that we do know that there are some more vulnerable groups to this kind of issues. Children, youngsters, indigenous communities. We do know that they are more affected by this. And in Chile, this is a very interesting survey conducted by the Defensoría de la Niñez back in 2019. And you can see that the topic of greatest interest to children and adolescents in Chile are the protection of the environment and the protection of animals. And all the surveys we have conducted in our country and in Latin America show that most people are really, really concerned about climate change. okay? And that's very important to support the argument, because do you really need to keep hearing that we are running out of time to do something about climate change? That's the rhetoric, you know? So the sense of urgency. We're running out of time, you know? And we hear that every 2 years, every 3 years, and now we're going to die in 2010, 2020, 2025. And this started at least in 1970 with the population bomb, a book written by Ehrlich, saying that in the 21st century, 2000, because of overpopulation, the planet will be already doomed, collapse, you know? But my point is that I think we don't need to keep hearing that kind of messages. We are worried enough. You Google climate change, that's the kind of pictures you get, you know? We don't need more fear. We don't need more fear because fear makes us more selfish, immobilize us, or just to run away. And that's exactly what we don't need when we are dealing with a problem like climate change. So we need hope. And that's why I really enjoy Marek's presentation, because that's exactly the point we are working with my team. And well, we have a growing number of articles talking about this. This is from this year. And so hope has been viewed since ancient times as a bedrock of human thriving, and contemporary evidence suggests that hope is a determinant of health. So there's a connection between hope and health. But obviously, the climate crisis and other threats are making very difficult to experience, you know, that feeling of hope, you know, feeling a more positive emotion, you know, regarding the environmental crisis. So why is hope important? Basically, because hopeful people feel better than hopeless people. That's, you know, clear. And hope leads to action. And we need climate action. We need more people involved in climate responses. And hope leads to action. And hope is empirically justified by all the scientific reports. We still have time. We still have room for action. So we really need to do stuff. That's why I think it's really important to write new stories based on hope. What can you do? Because you might say, okay, hope sounds good, but what do we do? So tell the truth. You know, so it's not about neglecting what's happening, you know. So we do have a problem, a serious problem, you know, but we have opportunities. So tell the truth, acknowledge grief, your emotions, accept your emotions, envision success. So what's the future we want? What's the story then that we want to hear for our future? Identify pathways to success, empower people to act, cultivate solidarity, and make room for joy. We really need to enjoy what we are doing in trying to take care of our planet. So we are experiencing the change of an era. I think that's my story. So I think we are in the middle of a change of era, you know, of an era. And such periods are turbulent, you know, no doubt about it. And climate change and biodiversity loss are two expressions of that transition, you know. So it depends on us. How are we going to get out of this transition, you know? The story we're going to tell. And that's why, you know, I want to finish with that idea that let's change the way we talk about climate change, especially to the younger generations. I didn't prepare this presentation especially for this activity. This is what we are talking about in general, you know, for the last 3-4 years. So it was very positive surprise to read and then hear your presentation, Marek, because was absolutely, I totally agree with that. And I think the point is that climate change is real. It can scare us, but it is also an opportunity to build a better society. And then, of course, let's think, study, talk, and build the future we want. And in that way, we can then think about new stories to tell, new stories to share, especially with children and young people like you. And that's it. Yeah, thank you. But I have a minute. I have a question for you, Marek. I'm going to come back there. So my question is, you talk about the idea that that people are climate illiterate. Okay, so what exactly do you mean by that? Because we have surveys where we ask people about climate change emotions, but also about climate change facts. So what's the main cause of climate change? And I know the situation in the US is particularly different to the rest of the world, but here in Chile, most people are aware of the problem, about the anthropogenic origin of climate change, and of course, it's not like a complex comprehension of the problem, But what do you mean when you say that? Because also, to my knowledge, Chilean schools are doing a really good job in environmental education, Probably with the approach you say, still people and nature, But what do you mean when I talk about literacy? That's my...
Yeah, thank you, Rodolfo. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a simple answer. I think that this is an emergent process that we haven't had, and of course, yes, you're absolutely right. The American context is very different, but in general, all of the dominant institutions that we have created for our civilization, our economy, our banking system, our production lines, everything that we have was designed without any concern for the biosphere. It was designed to produce very specific results with very specific outcomes within a very sort of closed system. But we never looked at, okay, and there is wastewater from this plant, or there is pollution, so across the board, we designed mechanisms of our civilization somehow assuming that the planet will just keep being, that forests will keep being, that fish in the oceans will just keep being, and everything will just continue. It will maybe diminish here and there, but like the general system will stay on. And now we know that it's not true. So climate illiteracy is the kind of, so one attempt to answer your question is that climate literacy is an active knowledge. It cannot be purely theoretical. So recently, last year, Canadian minister in the Canadian government so he's a minister for the environment and climate change specifically. He made an argument that Canada must expand oil production and pipelines and everything because they need more money to fight climate change. And okay, and this is a person who is very knowledgeable theoretically about climate change. And yet this person is endorsing the kind of activities that drive climate change. So this is one example of climate illiteracy in action, that very specific executive decisions are being made by very specific people. It's not the decisions that you guys make or anyone in this room, but there are people, city councils, parliaments, governments, the judicial system. It's a very specific companies, big corporations. If the board of Costco or BP or any other corporations or Mercedes or Volkswagen, if these people are serious about climate change, it is in their power to make a decision or a set of decisions that will steer their company away from, for example, producing this amount of waste, from consuming this amount of energy. They can retool toward green energy and so forth. It's unbelievably shocking when you realize how small, how tiny is the group of people who actually call the shots. By contemporary estimates, it's a group of about 500 men, they're almost always men, in the oil industry today. 500 men make executive decisions that impact billions of people on the planet. So it's like some guy 1,000 miles away made a decision about Santiago de Chile. Hey, we don't need the city, let's bomb it. You know, this is the scale and disproportion that of the processes that are happening is massive, it's global, and the opportunity, and I really liked what Claudia said about this, the sources of our disconnect from nature, that we have this schizophrenic perception. Oh, nature is this, but we humans are here. We're separate. We're doing our things, and nature does its own thing. No. So, to answer your question, climate illiteracy, we would become a climate literate society the moment that the push from bottom up becomes so big that this narrowing levels of decision makers, they have to do something because they are getting pushed with unrest and protests from the bottom. And then they're pushed into telling the people above them, hey, we really don't have a choice. We have to introduce this law. And so we have the opportunity to become a climate literate society when this knowledge translates into action. When we design our schools to be net zero buildings, for example. When we design our energy systems to be far more efficient than they are today. When everything is across the system. So, and it's not just my argument that we are a climate illiterate society, that it's, there's a ton of research on this, but, emotional disconnect is also another thing that plays a role here, that we are seeing things, but there is a mechanism that masks it, and sort of we continue with business as usual things. It's very complicated, but I do believe that we should at least try to become climate literate. Come on, let's try. What do we lose? So, but of course, figuring out, okay, but what exactly do we do with 6-year-olds? What do we do with, elementary grade schools? Like, what do you do with climate literacy in math? Or what do you do in language arts? Like, these are very specific practical questions that we need to figure out, but we can no longer pretend that climate change is only a thing for scientists, for climate science, and like, oh, it's a narrow group of people, they will figure it out, and we just live our lives normally. It's never going to change if we continue like this.
Thank you, Marek. We have, sorry, I'm on answer here, or here, that's better. We have one question from the audience, and I think it's rather directed to Rodolfo. And it says, in the field of social psychology, are communitarian societies more resilient or effective to face changes, and I guess climate change in this case?
To face changes?
Hola. Yeah. I don't know. Next question. No. No, I think each society, each culture has their own issues and problems. China is a collective society. All Asian countries are built on collective communities. We are more individualistic, and and I think we have different problems. So, but we all share climate change, you know, and environmental and pollution and all that kind of things. So probably it's that you have different approaches to the problem, you know. I had the privilege to live in Australia for 5 years studying over there, and I realized that we talk a lot about psychology of communities in Latin America, far more than in Australia, but communities are stronger in Australia than in Latin America. And that's maybe an explanation, you know. And they are both very individualistic society, culture, you know. So I think it's something to keep in mind when you think about the type of responses and how to get more people engaged in climate action. You know, definitely there are differences, but there are no one answer for that.
Okay, thank you from the audience for that. Thank you, Marek. I think we can maybe. Okay, I think I have time for one more question, and then we're going to have a question for the four of us actually. You were. I prepared two questions, but I think the first one about hope has pretty much been answered also. So I was just thinking, related to you didn't mention the word specifically today, I think, the idea of planetarianism. That's a hard one to pronounce, which I understand as the ecological civilization that we should be hopefully pointing at. And I just happened to hear Deepesh Chakrabarty a couple of days ago. He was talking about planetarian governance and planetarianism as a decentering the idea of us as humans. So I think that also connects to what Claudia was mentioning. And so Chakrabarty says the planetary environmental crisis calls us to extend ideas of politics and justice to the non-human, which again, I think this relates to what Claudia was proposing. And adding to that question about Rodolfo's question on what do you mean when you say that we are climate illiterate? I personally can't imagine that those 500 males making decisions on oil are illiterate in terms that they do not know, but they don't want to, they pretend that they're not affected by it. Or of course they feel like they are the ones that are going to be going to Mars and colonize Mars or something. So I was thinking from one of the things that Claudia mentioned from Anna saying the noticing. So I think that when you talk about probably climate literacy, you're thinking of something broader than when we think of literacy as the capability to use or to understand. It has affect into it. It has a value system into it. It has the joy that Rodolfo was mentioning. So how is your idea of that ecological civilization, in other words?
Yeah, I like it. I like it. I think that Chakrabarty, the idea that he builds on this dichotomy, planetary versus global. And he says that the word global is human-centric. It's like from human perspective. When you say that something is planetary, it sort of removes humans, not so much to the margins, but doesn't make them central. And then we're looking from the planetary perspective, where, for example, timescales are incomparable to human timescales and so forth. So this decentering, I think, is a very neat maneuver that we need to do. And this also ties to what Claudia was talking, that this cultural separation from nature that we have been developing for the past maybe 2,000-3,000 years at least. And it's sort of a collective baggage that we carry, but awareness is really where things start. And So for example, when you look at how we measure temperature, we have the Fahrenheit, it's of course only in the US, and then we have Celsius, the system that is used all over the world. And Celsius is an ecocentric system because you derive the value of 0 and 100 from the state of nature, so water liquid versus water boiling, water freezing, water boiling. So that's derived from nature. And Fahrenheit was invented as a system in which you take a human, and a human was supposed to be 100. So everything colder than human would be below 100, and everything above human would be above 100. And of course it didn't work. So human in Fahrenheit is 97 point something. I hate this system. Fahrenheit is horrible. But so it's a system created around humans. And we measure everything by human scales. So cosmic temperatures and everything else you measure by the standard of the human body. This is so freaking self-centered. This is just wrong. And because unless you assume that everything was created for us, the entire cosmos, everything was just created so that I could come on stage. Oh, how narcissistic can you be? So like awareness of, okay, this is a ecocentric system versus this is a anthropocentric system. And we have systems of thought, we have systems of finance, we have systems of education, we have systems of running societies, we have systems of ideologies that are ecocentric versus anthropocentric. And that's why, for example, all of these conversations about indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge systems, all of these point to the existing alternative. Hey, there are societies today, even societies that build their knowledge systems around nature, and they derive their knowledge from nature instead of centering themselves and then subjecting nature to these rigid forms. So awareness is the starting point, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much for
That, Claudia, I hear you nodding and saying, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't know if I can respond, but I think that react, yeah. I completely agree. And whenever, I listen to what you just were, saying again, I think that, this idea of what you were mentioning minutes ago about the relationship between economy and environment is something that we cannot avoid. And when you were talking, I was thinking, why is it then that we haven't been very serious about this crisis in schools? So because you were saying, yeah, of course, there are some schools that are very successful in terms of environmental education, but what is it? What is the successful part of it? It's like you are teaching values or strategies, but do they change the fact that we are going to be producing new subjects for this new area? I'm very, kind of complicated with that. Because of course there are some things that we can do, and I suppose that for at least 2 decades, there are a lot of people doing stuff, but the crisis is just being bigger. So what's the problem? So whenever I come to that moment is where I think that there is a habit of mind, and this is a phrase from Karen Barat, a habit of mind that we have to break some ways, because otherwise we're not going to get to understand, otherwise to act in a different way. If we keep on, imagining and producing knowledge because of this binaristic way of thinking. And when I say that, what I mean is that probably we need to be more flexible, not to destroy what we know so far, but to be more flexible. And particularly, I'm very into this idea of how do we think about knowledge we produce to explain and to understand the moment we are at right now. So I don't know, I think that it's very complicated. And when it comes to environmental education in schools, it's like, I always think about this way of, are we taking it seriously, and what it means to take it seriously? Is it that you're gonna learn how to recycle? or you're going to learn more about, what I was just saying, the ways that you create or not a relationship between nature and culture. How do you think about yourself as a human in relation to that nature that it looks to be outside, disconnected from you? So it seems to me that both things are, need to be happening at the same time. I mean, while you learn how to recycle, you also have to learn how to think about this relationship differently. Otherwise, it's not gonna make so much change.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Claudia. I think partially you've already answered the question that I have. I have one closing question, which is like the signature of these diálogos. So each one of you will have like maybe 2 minutes to answer it. And the question is, how do you imagine like a renewed life together, un nuevo cohabitar, a new, different type of coexistence? So let's just go from here to Marek.
Oh, let's start from Marek. I just talked to Rodolfo.
No, please.
The guest. Yes.
Okay, I have my mic, that's fine. So, okay, that's hard, but, okay, I would say one possible path or one possible challenge is to imagine ourselves as indigenous to nature rather than separate from nature. And we have this notion that, oh, there are indigenous people and there are regular people or just non-indigenous people. So there's always separation. You cannot become indigenous, and maybe indigenous person can, if they forget or deny, they can become like non-indigenous person, but really they are. So, but it's this sharp separation. And I am right now reading a book by Tyson Yucca Porta, who is an Aboriginal Australian PhD dude, a very fun guy. And he puts a challenge in the book that we should all find ways to become indigenous. We have been denied, through the stories we tell, we have been denied being indigenous. For example, indigenous to the places where we live, indigenous to the country in which we live, indigenous to regions, I mean, unrooted. So we have to come up with another way to think about indigeneity. And my big challenge, I love this idea. It blew my mind. So my big challenge for me now, I moved to Minnesota 10 years ago. So I'm still an outsider. I have an accent that everyone can tell I'm from somewhere else. But I want to become indigenous to the Great Lakes region. And my challenge is, okay, how do I become indigenous to the Great Lakes region? Like biologically indigenous. That's a wonderful, wonderful challenge. I have no answer. I don't know. But I do feel that starting with stories, starting with language is super important. I am absolutely convinced. That's probably one of the few things that I have really deep certainty about, is that we are creatures of language. We inhabit, I can tell where my body ends. My fingers end here, my feet end there. I sit here. I have the boundaries of my body. I know it. I don't have to remember. I don't have to learn it. And in the same way, we are creatures of language. We inhabit language, and we move in language like we move in physical space. We touch reality, change reality by words and concepts and ways of thinking. So I know that this work needs to happen in language, it needs to happen in stories, and it needs to be articulated, because to say something is a different thing than just have vague ideas in your head. And it's a tough challenge. But I think I love the challenge.
I think it's a very deep question. So I might say that probably because I'm a psychologist, although I don't want to confess that many times, sometimes, because, a lot of expectations about that and things that I don't like. But I think we need to teach more empathy in our society in general, and we need to treat nature as we treat ourselves, because we are the same, basically. So if we can teach other people and ourselves to treat nature like that, I think we can achieve changes, deep changes. I'm not saying nothing. This is not new, treat others like you like to be treated, but I think that's part of the connection, that if you think you're not going to take care of that tree because, it's a moral duty, because it's a nice tree and the oxygen, it's because it's part of what you are, and that, I think, is what I can say now about that.
Here we go. The question was about cohabit, right? How do we imagine that? A new form. All right. No, I don't know what will be the question for that, but listen to this. This is probably a short story. Bacteria made our oxygen atmosphere, and plants help maintain it. Plants live on land because fungi made soil by digesting rocks. As this example suggests, the world-making projects can overlap all the time. So imagine if our ways of being are emergent effects of those encounters and overlappings. Imagine how would it be for us to think about cohabiting today. To me, it will be just another way of understanding the world. So that's what I'm saying. If I can imagine how would it be to feel yourself as completely, being dependent on how a fungi, a bacteria makes its own for me to be here. Lovely, beautiful.
Well, thank you so much, all the three of you. Thank you, esta. Thank you, auditorium, and all the people back there making this possible. And thank you, all of you, audience here in this springy Friday afternoon. So I think we need a round of applause for all of us. And remember the students in the sustainability